Hey everyone, I'm Rather here, and this is going to be my last feedback video for Bloodborne So the Unseen for quite a while. It's been a fun alpha test, but I played around 20 scenarios of this in the past 2 or 3 weeks, so it's time to put it on hiatus for a while, come back after some more Arkham on a later build and give more feedback once the game's growing a little bit. Now, I've already made this video, uploaded it, and I've taken it down because Scenario 8 came out afterwards. So did a tabletop sim update. So obviously this stuff isn't quite where it goes, that's not quite where it goes. And there are lots of little things now where the game just doesn't need to be updated because like there's dynamic tracking of locations. They all have lines where there should be. Maybe it's not as good as it should be because this time it didn't load this line. The markers I got weren't correct. This isn't even here? I had no idea. This is what the map looks like? Dude, joke's on me. Good job, Tabletop Sim. Hats off to Tabletop Sim 3.0. Anyway, there's lots of little things where you update it to work with Tabletop Sim 3.0 more. Probably won't be all that much work, I hope at least. And like, that's really impressive. I didn't even think to check the location markers because when I'm given them, I just assume they're true. Evidently, the map wasn't right. That's crazy. Yeah, coming over to this, you can look at the scenario setup. There's a yellow circle. It says it connects here, and then there's very explicitly not a picture of yellow circle there. This connects down. So that might be unintentional. Maybe the icons are wrong and it's supposed to be the way it should, but yeah, that's the first bit of feedback. Thanks to Tabletop Sim 3.0. That's not even me. The game told me that one. I never noticed. Anyways, let's get into it. Let's talk about Arkham Sunrise. I'm also going to talk about the true ending, Blood Rapture, what they have in common, what was great, what needs to be changed in my opinion, and then I'll hand it off to Past Me to handle the first 7 parts of this, because I've now played this with my tabletop group and I've got feedback from them as well as things I've missed on my first playthroughs. So my first bit of feedback is just there are miscellaneous setup issues. That's a good example now. Let's see if this still happens though. If I place this version, yep, it rips off the scenario card instead of the bottom left location. There's just stuff like that throughout the campaign that needs to get sorted out. Not really sure why it happens. Oh, that's so cool. I'm sorry, I've never seen Tabletop 3.0 before. It stopped doing it now. What, do it now? Huzzah! I really like 3.0. I'm looking forward to this. Getting off at Tabletop Sim 3.0, let's get into the feedback. Arkham Sunrise's scenario card feels a little bit wrong. The tablet is scaling instead of the skull. And for balance reasons, that can make sense, but just like I'm programmed to think the skull scales and the tablet is, like it could scale, but it's usually static. So the fact that we have a non-scaling skull and a scaling tablet feels very weird to me, and I would like to see those reversed, and if necessary, the tablet made harder to compensate for the fact that it should be a worse token. A bit of really important feedback right away is this feels like a very meaningful, good payoff for high recognition, and I really, really like that. But a bad bit of feedback that comes from that is it feels like it's actually soft lockable with low recognition, and the reason for that is because you're going to be dropping the doll. When I say dropping the doll, you need to spend clues or recognition to pick up the doll, and the doll comes with an encounter set, including a card that makes you drop the doll. So it does feel soft lockable, especially if you end up flipping locations with clues, which I know is your fault. However, anytime something's soft lockable, it sort of stands out to me, especially when I'm playtesting. And in this case, I think the best and most appropriate thematic way to do it, because recognition is so valuable, recognition's best use, its most efficient use here, is 1 recognition to pick up the doll. The axe will have players' recognition uses for things, but this is the most efficient thing you can use it for. At least when looking at how valuable it is compared to the clue alternative, right? So what I would like to see is for one of the locations, I don't care which, this one being off to the side is the one that stands out to me as an option for it. I would like to see one of the locations be a failsafe location that doesn't refresh clues, but has something that you can just easily do, like take a horror or a damage or draw an encounter card to gain a level of recognition and have that on both sides of it. So that if you do find yourself soft locking, you can just like spend your time getting recognition so you can actually do stuff later. And even if you can't, it's just a cool location. You'll understand what it's for when you see it. And generally, I don't have like very strong opinions about most of these locations. So I feel like if any of them were reworked, it wouldn't be a huge loss. Although I do want to say that this side, the dream side, Rivertown of the starting location, is the biggest payoff for big money I've ever seen, and I absolutely love it. Now, despite the fact that Porcelain Heart does make the scenario soft lockable, the overwhelming opinion at my table is that we loved the doll encounter set. It does feel a little bit weird that Memento Mori does nothing if you don't have the doll, but it's also completely fine. If you don't have the doll, you're not making progress, so you don't need to be punished anymore. On the subject of things we like, we all really like Gurman, great art, very scary. He's also kind of a chump, like yeah, he does have 5 fists and like 7 health and 3 player, and he hits for 4 meat, which is horrifying. But realistically, with infinite setup time in Scenario 8, you should be able to deal with him first round, and for a boss that is kind of meant to be like that, he does his job so well. He's terrifying, he's the exact right level of threat level. I think there's nothing I would ever want to see changed about him. Now, one thing that I would like to see change is if you look at the shroud values, you're gonna notice the first location, the meta location that you have to go to progress, is a 4 shroud location. Oh, wait a second. Wait a second. Coming over to Blood Rapture, Gravemarked Trail isn't a meadow in that version. It's just a dream graveyard. I knew I wasn't crazy. In the first playthrough of this, my team was like, yeah, we can investigate at the meadow. And then we went over to the next version and we're like, wait a second, you can't investigate Gravemarked Trail. It's because it's not the same card. So that's an important bit of feedback. But these first 2 locations, 3 Shroud, discard a card, 4 Shroud, they're some of the hardest locations on the map. The easy locations are the ones that you get to go to later. And that feels very backwards. And the same is true in the other version because this is how you start in both of them. And it's not necessarily bad, but it feels off. Now, getting further into Arkham Sunrise, everyone on my team agreed we loved this encounter deck. It feels like a finale encounter deck. The one exception is Guiding Moonlight, which really doesn't feel like it should be in a finale because who cares if you get less experience. But Flora of the Moon is potentially terrifying. A Hunter Must Hunt will almost always punish your whole team because, well, there's only one humanoid enemy. Unspeakable Truth is a capstone to attacking your cards. Invite Madness is relatively soft. Beckoning Moon is super appropriate. Polite Exchange is pulling the one hunter enemy. Moonlit Night is increasing these high shroud locations by +2 and it's never going away, so it's not actually nearly as soft as it looks. Dreamfall does need an additional note about it. Selenian Evils is just a great Evils variant. I always love those cards. Winter of Dreams is Crypt Chill. Love to see it. Dreamfall, great card, absolutely terrifying, defines the scenario, really, really good. One small problem, that does say test foot and head X between 0 and 8, take the amount you fail by with no limit. That means that potentially you test foot 8 or head 8, and then you auto-fail and you just die. And it's not like you can choose not to take those, because you must pick different options. Those cards really, or those options rather, really should have, like at most, a max of 5 damage, even that's terrifyingly high. But Dreamfall just needs a max damage. Any number is fine, just not 8. Now, I said that we really like the doll set. However, dropping the doll in Arkham Sunrise feels terrible. And there's a very clear reason that it feels terrible in one version and not the other. They both have the first Act 1 and Act 2, and then things get different here, and you can immediately see why it feels so much worse than the other one. Your goal is to get the plain doll, and this one you have to spend clues or resources to get the plain doll by finding the location card. Then you move on to the next part. And this one you just get the doll immediately and you're essentially already at this part. Here you're looking for the doll, here you're flipping locations. You're still going to need to go through a bunch of locations, and this one on average half of them, and this one all of them. And this is definitely meant to take less time because it's basically 2 acts to this one's 1 act, as you can see by the fact we flip different numbers. But this is spend player clues or 3 resources. This is spend 2 player clues or player recognition. Those are not the same. First, spending player recognition might not be an optional in low recognition teams, which would by definition have to have played this scenario. They can't play the other version. Second, 2 player clues is just a hell of a lot. It feels very, very grindy. In addition, it really feels like it should just be a lightning bolt like the other one is. And as a result, the Cluebers felt like a tremendous amount of pressure playing Reclaiming Dawn that they didn't in the other one. And not the good kind of pressure, the oh god, this is going to take forever sort of grindy pressure that they felt was unpleasant. I would definitely prefer to see this be a lightning bolt. Every time there's any scenario actions, I'd prefer to see them be lightning bolts if at all possible. But I also think this should be 1 player clues and that the clue count on the map should probably be balanced around that. And on that note, let's go over to the Killing Moon, where you can spend 2 player clues as a group. And my team actually laughed when they saw that. They were like, where do they think we're getting these? Because once you've spent, what is it? There are 8 locations, 1, 2, 3, 4. To get here, you could have spent up to 16 players' clues. You don't have any left to do this. This is really just a payoff for recognition. But if you had recognition, you probably didn't get the clues. You used the recognition instead of getting the clues. So now you get here, it's like, oh, I guess I can go get clues and come back. But by that time, the fighter's already killed or died to the moon presence, right? Oh, also, the Killing Moon, this is very important. I didn't realize this the first time. That action to spend player clues as a group at the moon presence location, that provokes an attack of opportunity. It probably isn't supposed to do that. But because of this incredibly high player clue count over here, I think you end up in a situation where dropping the doll feels absolutely terrible in this version of the scenario. It feels like soft locking or even hard locking is a very real possibility, and it's why having that recognition backup would feel so nice. It would also give you alternative ways to get progress other than just going after this huge clue count. And again, I would really like to see this be a lightning bolt. Even more than I would like to see the clue count rebalanced, I would like to see this be a lightning bolt. Coming over to the Chosen Hunter, something my players picked up on that I'm not sure I agree with, but they might be onto something here, is that they thought the Chosen Hunter shouldn't be shuffling into the top 6 cards, but the top 2 players' cards. Now in 3 players that's the same, but the idea seems to be that Chosen Hunter is the only enemy in the encounter deck and you draw him every 2 turns, so on average a little bit faster than that every turn and a half. But that's only true at 3 players. On 4 players you're drawing him basically every turn. If you get lucky you'll see him the second turn. And on 2 or 1 player, you might not see him for a very long time. In 2 players you could take 4 turns on the 7th card, and 1 player you might just finish the scenario having seen this guy twice. I don't know, in 1 player, having to deal with this guy constantly is going to be a problem, but 1 player's never balanced anyway, and I'm not even sure I would worry about balancing around True Solo. Which is bad advice, don't get me wrong. But it does seem to be the case that this guy probably should be player scaling to like come back at a certain rate. And I understand why they felt that way, and it might be a good bit of advice. But I just look at that and I hear like 1 player sees this guy every 2 turns and go, Ashcan Pete is going to have a bad time. Now, regardless of how often I think the Chosen Hunter should come back, the fact is he will be coming back. The Moon Presence is not going to die, you're just going to exhaust them repeatedly. And there are no other enemies, it's just this. Which for such a fight-heavy campaign, it feels kind of low. And I'm not sure that thematically you can even fit more enemies in here. I think I'm fine with it, because you are like fighting non-stop as the group's main fighter, right? But it does feel a little bit off that there's like so much fighting up to this point, and then you get here and there's just 1.5 enemies basically total. What feels much worse though, I don't know where it is right now, I'm not sure which set it comes in. I think it's a Call Beyond? No, it's the Altar of Despair. So one of my players, Joe Diamond, did Jura's quest because Jura's so perfect for Joe, and he got the Pungent Compound because he knew, based on what I had said, that it would be a great counter to the Loran Silver Beast. Now this only works on non-elite enemies, and presumably if you're finishing a quest, it's around scenario 7 or 8. There are no non-elite enemies in this version of scenario 8, which makes the Pungent Compound quest feel really bad. Joe was very confused, like, wait a second, why is this in my deck? It literally doesn't work in this scenario, are you serious? He was very upset about this. Now, generally speaking, I want to see more attack cards in the sets and more forced interaction with the attack cards from the players. However, this entire scenario is basically the Moon Presence chasing you and your fighter having to deal with them. I wouldn't mind having an extra attack set you shuffle in with the Killing Moon. I definitely wouldn't mind that. And it does sort of stand out to me that in the final scenario, the boss doesn't have an attack set. I was kind of hoping it would once we got to the Killing Moon. So it's not a problem, but just like I said, I want to see agendas forcing you to draw attack cards when the boss is out. I want this guy to have an attack set. It's one of the coolest parts of this campaign for me, and the fact the final boss doesn't have one just makes me sad. And before I move on to Blood Rapture, you'll notice the Moon Presence is a 5-fist enemy with Retaliate, and the Squid is -4, the nearest great one attacks you. If you attack the Moon Presence and you're not attacking at 9, it's terrifying. Speaking of, there are additional autofills in the bag when you're attacking him. But that's not the Squid, you're not getting double hit. If you pull a Squid, like if you attack this guy at 8 and you pull a Squid and you go down to 4 to 5 and you miss, he hits you for 4/4, it's horrifying. On the whole, I don't know if I think that needs to be changed. I don't really want the Moon Presence to lose Retaliate, I don't really want him to lose a fist, and I don't really want the Squid to get softer. But it is like a thing I feel the need to note, just how scary it is to swing at this guy without insanely high numbers. Before I go into Blood Rapture, there are 6 custom investigators that are essentially rewards for playing this campaign, and they are really cool, especially Alfred. I fucking love Alfred. But custom investigators aren't really my thing, custom cards aren't really my thing, so I'm gonna be refraining from giving feedback on these, other than Alfred seems dope. He seems like he's living up to the promise of what Tommy Muldoon wants to be and what Doom Mystics want to be. I really, really like his deck building. His ability is overpowered, and then I look at like what every Seeker's doing, and I'm like, yeah, it's fine. The first thing I want to note with Blood Rapture is when you do the thing with the encounter deck and you shuffle 7 cards with the doll, and you put them at all the locations, you're gonna get your 7 cards, and you're gonna get the doll, and... right. So we always just used Gurman as a surrogate doll at my table because it's just an easy solution that's there, but she should have an encounter back to fix that. Next, after you actually get the doll, this doesn't tell you to do anything with the rest of the encounter cards, and there's no longer an ability to get rid of them, not that you would choose to do so given that option. So I would like to see a little clause in here somewhere like discard all the remaining encounter cards attached to locations. In Arkham Sunrise, I said that it felt weird that there was like 1 enemy and then 1 recurring enemy, and that it sort of felt like there should be more enemies considering how fight heavy the campaign was. That doesn't hold a candle to my things I had to say about this encounter deck though. We're going to dive into the whole encounter deck in a second, but in this scenario you have 3 copies of Sumerian Right Keepers, 3/2/2 enemies. You have 3 copies of Sumerian Pilgrims, 1/1/1 aloof enemies, and 2 copies of Sumerian Chieftains, 4/3/2 Hunter Retaliate enemies. None hit for a lot, and they're just not scary enemies. Like, I'm gonna be honest with you, I look at this guy, and I look at Ravenous Ghoul, right, from the core set, from Scenario 1 of the game. I look at Sumerian Chieftain, and I look at Ravenous Ghoul, and I think they're the same picture. I don't see the difference in these enemies. You're expected with the core set in your first scenario of the game to kill a Ravenous Ghoul. This is the strongest enemy in Scenario 8 of a fight-heavy custom campaign. That's not okay. The fight difficulty in this version of the scenario is catastrophically low. There needs to be stronger enemies in this. This set's cool, I'm fine with this set. I don't particularly think this set needs to be tuned up that much. It probably should be. This guy could do with 4 health, he could do with hitting harder. This guy's completely fine, this guy's completely fine, because these are throwing a wrench in the works, right? They're slowing down your cleavers, not fighting you. But there should be an entire second set of scarier enemies. And I'm gonna get more into why in a second, but when I was discussing how many more enemies and how scary should they be, I threw out the spitball idea, and no one was really objecting to this. What if you just shuffled in every single Metamorphosis and Milkweed enemy you hadn't yet dealt with? Now thematically, that's dissonant as hell and garbage, but no one thought that would be crazy. They were all like, you know, considering how much fighting isn't in this scenario and the campaign we came through to get here, that doesn't sound that crazy. It would be terrible, don't do that. But that's an idea of just how many more enemies you can put in this scenario without being out of line with the rest of the campaign. Oh, and before I leave these enemies, Sumerian Pilgrim is grammatically unclear. You must place 1 doom on it. Is it the location or the Sumerian Pilgrim? Grammatically, it's the location. We always grimroll it to be the location, but you should just have it be place 1 doom on the location or on Sumerian Pilgrim to avoid that confusion. Before I move on to the rest of the encounter deck, at the end of this, you're going to have all the locations in a line. You have to walk from left to right. There's like no pressure. It's a victory lap. It's more of a victory lap than it was in Edge of the Earth. It's more of a victory lap than it was in Doom of Estili. It's just walk right for a couple of turns. There's really nothing that impedes you. Even if you do have enemies, you can probably just carry them with you and leave. So for me, intuitively, a way to make that escape harder is to have a bunch of scary-ass enemies spawning in this. If this act here was like, at the end of each round, discard cards until you draw an enemy, or an enemy with a trait that wasn't on these guys, like a different traded enemy set so that they are forced to spawn the scary ones, that would be a good way to make leaving a lot harder. It's part of why I really aggressively noticed there aren't any enemies is because nothing opposed us while we were escaping. Whereas in Doom of Estili, all the enemies you've evaded show up between you and the exit. In Edge of the Earth finale, all the Ancient One little goop guys get in between you and the finale, or they try to and fail horrifically, but the spirit was there, right? So the lack of enemies, both in the structure of this scenario and as the finale to this campaign, just stands out. It's more difficult, it's legitimately more difficult to do fighting in The Hunt Begins than it is in this scenario. If you can get through Gurman, the idea that you fail to fight the rest of this is just laughable. And unfortunately, the whole encounter set's really soft, and these are the 2 biggest culprits by a mile. Winds of Phantazos, I think, was just misprinted or something. I don't understand what this card's supposed to do. Because you can either get overzealous or you can move to a connecting location. Like, I don't understand. I honestly don't know why you would ever pick the first one. I just don't get it. It needs to do something else. I don't have feedback, I'm just confused. And this is a head test, and if you fail it, you get a basic weakness that wasn't that threatening. You just get self-centered, right? These are 4 cards, and I think a 27 card encounter set, that basically do literally nothing in the finale. Also, there are 5 more cards that almost do nothing. Invite Madness, you will eventually draw a weakness you've already drawn, or you're gonna discard cards, which is, you know, game theory, that's nothing. And then you draw a weakness that's in your deck, which is probably not much harsher than most finale encounter cards, right? And then Whisper of Somnus is just, it's foot bad from Dream Eaters, right? Except it's much worse because instead of -1, you take 1 and 1. Drawing both at once is a lot scarier. But honestly, it's just not that scary of a card. It wasn't scary in Dream Eaters and it is scarier here, but it's not much scarier. It's again very soft. Coming up to the next tier of cards, these actually do something, it's just not a whole lot. Testly Book is pretty easy to pass. You have literally anything to help. Basically, anyone with a Promise of Power has good odds here. Every time an investigator fails a skill test, that investigator takes 1 horror is definitely scary, and it discards 1 per round, which is also scary. Actually, side note, the way this is phrased at the end, force at the end of the round, discard 1 copy of Horrors of Iklios. All 3 of those have that text, and all 3 of them discard 1 copy of Horrors of Iklios, so they all get discarded. The way this is phrased on all the other cards like this is something to the effect of, at the end of the round, discard Horrors of Iklios, and then in parentheses, max once per round. That's the way it needs to be phrased. But yeah, even though this is kind of scary, it often doesn't do all that much. And then Beckoning Moon really slows you down more than anything, unless you're the fighter, in which case it does next to nothing. But Beckoning Moon's just like not really a problem, it's not killing you. There's only really 2 encounter cards in this entire set, Sanguine Evils and Unspeakable Truth, that are really scary. Unspeakable Truth, this is a great card, it's a good capstone to all the adverse ways you're attacked, unusual ways you're attacked, where it goes after resources and cards, and you just need to have more draw or more economy if you're playing this campaign. It's part of why I really like the spend 3 resources here, because that's a way the campaign has been built. It's attacking your resources, so having extra resources being rewarded in the finale. And as well, the doll card, is it Memento Mori? You can spend clues or resources. Again, it's that same theme. So with the other version in Arkham Sunrise, where it's just making use recognition, that thematic resonance is gone, the difficulty is much higher, it doesn't have as much payoff for recognition, because you have so many uses for recognition that you feel like you needed more. Whereas in this one, you can still spend all your recognition very validly dealing with other things, like Odin, for instance, who we'll talk about in a second. On the whole, I just really like the way you're attacked on resources and cards in this campaign, and I think that that resonance is lost somewhat in the other version of the scenario. And while these 2 cards are scary as hell, it's 5 cards out of like a 27 card encounter deck. The rest of it's so soft, we felt very non-threatened. With Arkham Sunrise, we felt like it was a finale deck, we were appropriately scared of it. And in this one, we were like, oh man, hey guys, foot bad, and then we would all laugh and be like, I didn't draw anything either, I just can't move for a turn. Now, Sanguine Evils, I do want to comment on something. This is going to get into mechanics of Doom. The agenda doesn't change. There's always going to be an 18 Doom agenda too. And right now, it's the first iteration of Scenario 8. It's not tuned right. That's not even like up for debate. If you expect it to be tuned right, that's crazy. There are 2 different scenarios with 1 Doom clock. It's going to be a tuning nightmare. But especially if you have one side using player clues, and then the other side using 2 player clues, and one side only needs, on average, to flip 4 cards, so they spend 4 player clues. The other side has to spend 8 times 2, 16 player clues. Like, the Doom Clock and the True Ending is so loose. In a large part, that's because the Doom Clock is tuned around the other version, so there's no time pressure in True Ending, it feels like. Yes, Odin, let's talk about him for a second. Odin will give you a Doom every round, but you're using your recognition to stop that. And even when I forgot to do this in my playthrough and Odin just kept placing Doom because I was an idiot, I made a note like, all right, we should have this much Doom left, I forgot. And then even without retroactively having used the ability that I should have that had no cost to me, basically, I still beat the Doom Clock with relative ease. This Doom Clock is balanced around a much harder scenario than this one, and that's a big part of why I think they both need to spend player clues. Or if one's going to be harder, it should be this one, because you need to spend less clues on average. But then if you get the worst RNG, it's way harder, and that's not great. So I really do think they should just both be player clues. The reason for that tangent is that Sanguine Evils places 1 Doom on the current agenda, or Odin attacks your entire team for 2/2. Now, much like with Azathoth, you don't want that second option, but unlike Azathoth, where 1 person takes 3/3, even in 2-player, this is 4/4. In 3-player, this is 6/6, and 4-player, this is 8/8. It's not even a decision point. Every single person, the first time they got this, was like, how much does Odin hit for? Yeah, Ancient Evils. No one even briefly considered it. I honestly think that as loose as this Doom Clock is, this is going to be up for tuning, it could change a lot. But I could see this being placed to Doom on the current agenda, and that's some scary shit. That's the kind of text that makes you feel a lot of fear. Place to Doom, or everyone gets hit for 2/2 feels like a finale card. A Doom Clock this loose, this is a blank. It should be the scariest card in this set, but we would breathe a sigh of relief because it was another card that did nothing. There was only 1 actually threatening card in the set, because with the current Doom Clock, this just isn't a problem. Coming over to Act 4C, the Augur of Ebrietas dying would cause you to lose the game. I think it should be the Augur of Ebrietas leaving play instead on this one, because it already gets forced into play previously. And in addition, having your whole arm ripped off with the Augur of Ebrietas is thematically really cool, and I loved it, even though it is a huge problem from a gameplay perspective. But it makes a lot of sense if you just discarded it to Crypt Shield or something because you didn't care about it. And to some degree, I wonder if maybe the fact that your fighter might be losing their weapon is why the end of this is so easy that it was balanced around that. That could be the case. If that is the case, then you just gotta change it. Like, you can't have the end be a walkover because you took away the ability to fight in a fight-heavy campaign. I love this thematically, But if the balancing concern is that your fighter can no longer do the job when they lose their hand slot weapon and their hand, then you just have to change this. But I think that's it for my criticisms and the things I love the most about this finale. On the whole, despite like having gone for about 35 minutes about all the things I would like to see changed, I did really enjoy both versions of Arkham Sunrise. I enjoy the version with the moon presence much more. It feels much more refined and much more tight. This version feels not like an afterthought. That's way too harsh. This version feels in much more dire need of tuning. The encounter deck is much too soft. There's not enough fighting for a fight-focused campaign. And I think I like both versions quite a lot, but the other one is much closer to being in its final state than Blood Rapture is. And at this point, since I'm done with Scenario 8, I'm going to hand it off to Past Me to cover the previous 7 scenarios. I have played off the channel with my tabletop group now. We're on Scenario 5 of 7. Before I finish this video, we'll be on 7 of 7. I'm going to give the feedback that I forgot in my first video, and I'm going to give the feedback I've gotten from my tabletop group as well, and new feedback I found during those playthroughs. And first things first, my tabletop group got on to me about this one. The art's top notch. I don't see good art, I see bad art. If I don't see your art, you're doing things well. They're very happy, very, very happy about the quality of the art throughout this. And in addition, they've been having a great time. I made a video yesterday specifically about how our specific variant we got of Ultra Despair was incredible. And as a result, it was their favorite scenario in the set. And it's actually, like, that specific variant is my favorite scenario in the set. When we get to Ultra Despair, I'll talk about that. And a lot of the feedback they give is already the same sort of feedback I've given, but there have been new things we've been discovering, and I'll go through now and start doing it all. As we start going into Scenario 1, as I start looking through the encounter cards and trying to figure out what things I have to say, I do want to mention, in my first video for this, I largely ignored specific balance comments. I pointed out a lot of things that either did literally nothing or were so insanely overtuned that it blew my mind. For instance, Polite Exchange having Psychopomp songs stapled on as a backup effect when it's far more terrifying than the main effect the card has. In fact, I think it's more terrifying than Psychopomp song because it goes off immediately and you can't choose who it goes off on. So while I was giving balance advice on like really far ends, I would call most of the criticisms and feedback I had in the previous video structural feedback. Changing rules so that they work. Cards that do nothing need to do something, cards that do way too much need to do reasonable amounts. But I didn't give like specific fine-tuning advice because I didn't really feel like I was suited to comment on that with only one playthrough. Furthermore, in your first playthrough, it's a lot harder to detect variance. It's easier to see what the RNG is doing on second and third playthroughs. Your first playthroughs will have a much more emotional judgment of things. But second, all of the fine-tuning is less important because if we're still making structural changes, then we can't know the full ecosystem any minor change will live in. The overall balance is going to shift so much that fine-tuning isn't really possible. However, I will be giving a lot more fine-tuned balance feedback in this video because I do have like a little bit of a leg to stand on now that I played it twice in different player accounts with completely different characters. The Sweet Stench still does literally nothing, and Yarnum Hospitality still does literally nothing to some characters while crippling others. Come over to Bloodrunk, it should say you get -2 to all skills and deal +1 damage during fight actions to not just buff Mystics and other non-traditional fighters. But on the whole, I really like this card. I think it's something your fighter should be planning around. It lives in a really cool space. Maybe slap on a limit 1 per character, but on the whole, I'm drawn on Bloodrunk quite a lot on my second playthrough. That's really all I have to add for both encounter decks. Let's get through all the locations in this scenario and see if I have any additional feedback for those. Something I didn't appreciate in my first playthrough of this scenario is that I really like having a 4-shroud location right at the start, and when you leave, it goes away forever as a form of degrees of completion. I actually really like that this is 4-shroud. It's very, very good. During our playthrough, we briefly considered, like, should this be lower shroud? And we were like, no, it's actually really good to the left. We were all very happy with that location. And on the whole, I think this is just a wonderful degrees of completion scenario that's super fight-focused. In our playthrough, we ended up failing to get first floor examination room and narrow alleyway, but we did manage to kill both the Cleric Beast and get the Somber Memorial cleared out. So that was really cool to see a way the scenario could play out where you still got like the expected 9 of what you should see out of a full clear, I think. But it wasn't the 9 that I expected to get. I was expecting to get this one and not this. And I just really, really like this scenario as a whole. Of all the scenarios, it definitely feels the most polished. It's really cool. It sets the tone for the campaign in a great way, and I'm very happy with how the hunt begins. I have very little balance tuning to give to that at all that I haven't already given in previous videos. And as we come over to Scenario 2, I've given a lot of the feedback before the videos have even come out over to the developers, and I've already been handed some of the stuff they did. I've seen some of their changelog, and they sent me this image. I am thrilled with like how quickly they came up with this, and also just how elegant this is as a solution. It's a lot of what I suggested in the previous video. And this spend 3 clues is still very much in the fine-tuning phase, but the ability to spend clues to deal damage to enemies in a tower defense scenario, especially one where you're essentially viewing this as laying traps, right? And the cathedral that you're guarding, like thematically it works, mechanically it works. It's a really good thing. Even if it's at 3-player clues, you're still dealing testless damage at other locations. They said over chat with me they were considering moving it down to 2 clues. Doesn't really matter. The important thing is that now finding clues is building towards a powerful effect, and Cluebers has something to do, and that's just wonderful. And as I look through everything in Scenario 2, I think I have almost no additional feedback to give on it. I think that card fixes almost every issue I addressed in the previous scenario, and I think all of my issues with this scenario were structural issues. I think of the scenarios in the campaign, it had a pretty solid mix of damage and horror from the encounter set. It didn't really have any tuning advice I have to give, but I will stop and say Breach is just a wonderfully designed card. This specifically is the thing you need to encourage more enemy density and mix up where the enemies are spawning. This card is really, really nice, and it's one of the best cards in the set for making it feel like a far more interesting tower defense. Coming over to Scenario 4, Night Unending, there is a swapping mechanic that goes on that to us never really felt like it added anything to the scenario at all. However, specifically Alt the Trail doesn't say unrevealed, and we did hard lock ourselves because we were like, yeah, let's try it and see if it does lock. And the answer is yes. This should say unrevealed, I'm sure it's supposed to, and it just doesn't. But you can hard lock if you have Alt the Trail and bad luck, so that should say unrevealed as well, just like these other two do. Now, I've got out a collection of other cards here that all have interesting things I need to say about them. First, in my previous video, I had a concern that could Fury the Bereaved and Invisible Opposition bankrupt your fighter. The answer is that I was at the time incorrect about how your threat area worked. I can't find it in the rules right now, but some feedback I gave in the first video is just objectively wrong. I'm sure the developers either thought that or knew that and found this out that my criticisms are just wrong, but hey, that's how it goes. Playtesters aren't always accurate. So you can, it turns out, activate something attached to someone else's items. In the book, it gives specific examples, and that's what I always remembered. You can activate things in someone else's threat area, but this isn't in their threat area. But those are examples of the phrase, you can use triggered abilities on an encounter card, any encounter card at your location. So this would obviously be at your location and you can't help with it. The question is now, does peril stop them from interacting with it? Which I still think the answer is no, but that is actually just open-ended and up for debate. Anyway, because your teammates can spend X resources to kill this, and they can also spend the resources to punch a guy knowing they'll miss, but doing it to get rid of this, I think that both of these cards are completely fine and there's no fear of them bankrupting your fighter. Next up, we have Chime Maiden, and she should clarify, how does she interact with Host of Serpents? She should say that she ignores their normal spawn condition, I think, because Host of Serpents popping out of the Chime Maiden makes as much sense as then popping out of anything else. But technically, his spawn condition fails and he fizzles. And I think that's just a design oversight that needs to be clarified. Guiding Moonlight, everyone at my table agreed when they saw this should just be the whole party. There's no reason it should be only the person who drew it. And I finally figured out what Burden of Knowledge does, which is it does nothing most of the time. As of the end of Scenario 5, on my second playthrough of the campaign, this is almost scary when you're fighting Rom. It's not really scary when you're fighting Rom, but it does do something then. It still seems like it does nothing almost all the time though. I was originally just looking at these cards because I was thinking, do any of them have anything I need to say? Have I said everything I need to say? Is Dark Beast Parle fine? Because we did fight and kill Dark Beast Parle. It was a hell of a brawl. I did take 3-6 on Diana to trip him repeatedly for my team. It was rough. But I don't think Dark Beast Parle is unmanageable. I felt like I was able to deal with him. He does feel overtuned, but he's Victory 2. He's optional hard mode, so it's okay that he's overtuned. However, what I was realizing as I looked at these and thought, is there a way they could be improved? What if the way they worked is that, whenever you flip the first act of the first agenda, it just always spawned these guys? If instead of being random in the deck, you knew that when you flip the first thing, you're getting one of these guys. Just the thought I'm having. It would require a lot of reworking on text in various places, but it would be nice if it worked that way to avoid, just randomly drawing Dark Beast Parle on turn 2. Not that that happened, but if it had happened, it would have been terrible. Want to say again, Shadows of Yharnam, absolutely sick card. Love the design, love how it feels to fight, love that it does feel like the false fight it's supposed to be. Coming over to these 3 locations, Gibbeting Path, Unto the Graves, and Deserted Trapping Village, I think the other 2 need to be redesigned to be more similar to Gibbeting Path, because this is the only one we ever did. Joe was like, hey, I can go do that test, and we can learn the secret of Hemwick without having to wait for the witches to show up. Because when you kill, I've already deleted them, but when you kill the 3 Agents of Impurity, which you will eventually get from the agenda deck, no matter what your recognition is, when you do that, you get these things. You learn the Queen's name, the secret, you found the Confederation's headquarters. No, you stop an infestation. So you can have found the Confederation's headquarters as the alternative here, right? Spend clues or do the other thing, and I'm okay with this one. But in all of them, you spend the resources required to reveal 2 new locations, instead of just like killing a boss that you're gonna have to kill eventually anyway. So, especially on this one where there's no alternative. This is just a trap. Using these clues just cripples your tempo for no reason. And I'm willing to bet that a lot of the reason the Doom timer has consistently felt loose from the teams I've been in is that we have never spent clues on either of these. So we were just 4 locations ahead of where a team would be if they were using these actions. And I kind of feel, much like the Scenario 1 cards, those are just traps. The ability to get tempo by doing this test ahead of time and not waiting for the boss, I'm completely fine with that. But having to use all the clues on the location to open it is just a trap. I don't think that should be the case. And I think that's it for this scenario. We're already done. That brings us to scenario 4, which I've already deleted, the Frailty of Men. And we really like this scenario. It does run a little bit on the long side. It can be a bit tilting. We eventually had a 50% guess rate, but every single time we flipped a location, we saw the one we hadn't seen previously. So we'd like see 1 Bergenworth, then 1 Miskatonic. So there's no knowledge to guess with there. And our first 3 consecutive guesses were all wrong. That can be pretty unfun, but our RNG did finish out, level out over the course of the scenario, so chalk up another one for Gambler's Fallacy, it wins again. But on the whole, it's just like a solid, well-built scenario. Its Doom timer felt a little bit loose for us, but on 2-player it felt really tight for me, so I think it's probably where it should be. I think Daniela, Ursula, Flex, Joe was a really strong team, and that might be part of why it felt loose for us. The main criticism I have this scenario: first, let's get out the Garden of Eyes again. He's just gotta get out. You just gotta talk about Garden of Eyes if you're in this scenario. This is not what Garden of Eyes looks like. That is not true game. No wonder I couldn't find Garden of Eyes. So Garden of Eyes is a nightmare. The patch notes I've gotten from the developer include some change to them. I don't know what it is because it's just relatively brief on all the changes. I think that it's almost okay now. If it were nerfed just a little bit, like as an additional cost, like after you perform a non-move action, that way killing it when you kill it, since it's already dead, you wouldn't have to. That would be nice. If it were after, that would soften it just a little so that you could actually fight them. But the messy, nasty counterplay, because this is like a scenario where you have to do a lot of flat actions moving from all these locations repeatedly, I think it is actually just harder on 2 players, and I think that's part of why these guys felt so nasty, is because they were like the counterplay is just easier to do when you have more people, right? Because you just avoid the locations, but when you're already almost out of time from moving everywhere, it feels worse. So I don't think these guys need to be softened too much, although I do question why they have 5 foot. Who the fuck is evading this guy? It doesn't do anything. You have to engage the aloof enemy, trip him. He's still doing his thing, even if he's ready, so it didn't do anything. Why does he have 5 foot? What's that for? It doesn't need to be changed. I'm not saying that. It's just like a funny flavor thing that he's untrippable, because why the hell would you? Now, interestingly, this encounter set isn't tilted towards horror or damage. This attacks you in very indirect ways. It robs you of resources and card draw. It doesn't really attack horror or sanity at all. It's a very different form of opposition. And it's a very unique, interesting scenario. I have nothing bad to say about most of it. But coming over to ROM, we do need to talk about this boss fight, because it's sort of just, like, in my playthrough, I thought it was really easy, but I have a hard time judging that playthrough on the channel, because Skids and Diana are so good at fighting that it warps things a lot. In my playthrough, I also forgot that Rom himself is a spider, so he should have 1 more fist. I don't know if that would have mattered. But they were just able to, like, pretty easily stomp on the spider. It wasn't a big deal for them. God, I hate his face. But my issue with it is mostly just that, like, this mechanic, it's fine for Kluber's fighting Rom. Like, it's obviously meant to be a clue finder boss fight. 6 players scaling, he's aloof, engaging him, summons a spider that just makes it harder. The shroud's not that high. This is definitely meant for Klubers to fight the boss, because the enemies mostly stay in the set, so it becomes the fighter's job to protect them while they investigate the Moonside Lake. And I actually think that's like a way cooler thing. That's actually what happens in Rom's fight in the game. I think this is a really cool interpretation of what Rom's fight could have been. But my issue is that consistently there's just like not enough enemies for the fighter to struggle to protect your team. I was doing all the fighting for 3 players as Daniela with ease. The Klubers were crushing the location with ease. I think I'd like to see this go up to 4 Shroud or 3 players clues. Because as it stands, even though it's meant for Klubers to solve it, I've never seen anyone take damage from this effect. And we've dealt the value of clues to Rom every turn, killing him in 3 turns with clues. And I just don't see it not playing out like that, really. it seems very, very hard not to kill Rom. And this is with an Ursula, like a character who moves to get clues that wasn't getting their value, still easily handled this alongside Flex Joe. And like, yeah, sure, we've got 2 Seekers in the party, so it's probably just broken. But I do have the overwhelming impression that Moonside Lake needs to be a little bit harder to find clues on. Whether it's because there's more clues, so more clue finding pressure, or more shrouds, so it's just easier to fail. As it stands, just a walkover location causing a walkover boss. Unfortunately, I started talking to my teammates about how much I dislike these cards before they could see them themselves. I wish I had just shown them these cards and said, hey, what do you think of these? And let them tell me what they thought of them without any outside influence from me. But once I had talked about it and showed it to them and like taken a break and asked them, they were all like, can we take basic weaknesses instead? Because all of this is broken and either does nothing or horrifically cripples us. So in that campaign, we all took random basic weaknesses instead of these. So I guess that's the not so polite reminder that this is an urgent need of fixing. Which brings us to Ultra Despair, and once again I deleted it the instant I've opened it. Now, I made a video specifically about this. There are 4 random acts. And there are also 4 portraits, and you'll be getting a random version of each one. And what's going to happen is you're going to have a random portrait at a random location, and it's going to be your objective. You'll need the red key. All of the portraits have a random key behind them. So you have to go to the other portraits to find the red key to open the one that you get. All of this randomization doesn't really need to happen. I have a video about specifically what I think needs to happen, and we're going to show it off in a second. I think there is a very clear best iteration of this that should just be locked. You don't need all this randomization here. You don't need to do that at all. It'll make setup smoother. It'll make the campaign consistent, which means it's balanceable and not you're balancing around 4 different possibilities. I will say I love the opening to this. I love that all these locations just suck to be at, and you just need to like run forward, get clues, and leave as fast as possible. And if you don't, well, congratulations. The Doom moves forward, lose all your clues, like start over from 0, and here's some enemies by the way. I think that will snowball against players, but I like having a hard fire under the players to make them go. And that's what happens just intuitively. When you see that all the locations suck and there's a location you can't get to, it makes you feel like you need to go progress as fast as possible. And you can just get all the clues at the location you need to spend them, right? Like it doesn't take you that long to get through. I think it's a really good race setup. And then when you go into Act 2, you move forward, you set up the next locations. And you have this tower with the objective at the top. It's where Hamatani will spawn. You need to clear out each location of clues as you go up. When you get here, there's a little interlude. She attacks you have to kill her, and when you do, she advances the act. And I guess now we'll need to pick an act, and I'll be picking the specific one for Provost Wilhelm, and I'll show you why. So when you do setup, you remove 1 portrait at random from the game for each of these, and then when you advance to Act 2, you put a random portrait at each of these locations, and that just randomized into what I was going to rig it as. I would suggest always having Portrait of the Headmaster either here or close to here towards the bottom. The reason I suggest this is if you're forcing them to go all the way to the bottom, then you can balance on the assumption that they're walking this far every time. They might not have to go into all of these rooms, they might only have to go in 1, or maybe they do have to go in all 3. But you can balance a little bit tighter knowing they're always going this far. They're not going to do what I did in the video, walk down, get the key, walk down, go to the objective, literally fast as you humanly can do it. I think this is a little bit better for the potential to balance things. But then something really important happens. You go to these rooms, you get the keys, 1 each will get a face down key, eventually 1 will be the red key, and you can come over here and open it this one now. This one is the Orphanage. Both versions of Orphanage have the same important bit of text, which is that now whenever anyone draws a kin-traded enemy, it's going to spawn here. Now, let's talk about why it's super important for Provost Wilhelm to be specifically the place you're getting. You're going to be putting the surgery altar next to whichever portrait was the objective. Because when you open the orphanage, you advance, and you're going to put the altar location to the right of the orphanage. And those other ones all don't say the orphanage, they all say their respective locations. I did a double check to make sure I'm not crazy. I'm not. It's all going to be whichever one you had to go to. Then you do the surgery altar, whether you attach 2 keys or get the clues, you eventually flip it, and that puts the audience chamber into play. When you flip the audience chamber, you advance the act, Abrietis and the altar of Spirit spawn, and you go into the dual part Act 5. In Act 5, every kin-traded enemy gains Hunter, and they're all spawning right behind you, and they're running at double speed through the cistern to try to stop you from killing Abrietis, which is their god, their mom. It's all a little bit ambiguous at this point, but the point is it makes a lot of sense they're there trying to stop you. Thematically, this is the right location to be next to Abrietis. And then additionally, the pressure of having enemies spawn here and run in, and they will be spawning because there's just an agenda that forces at least one kin enemy to spawn every round. Theoretically, you could draw a non-kin enemy, but there's like one of those in the deck, so it's not that likely. You're almost certainly spawning a kin enemy here every round, they're running in. And this is just such a cool way for the scenario to play out. I think if you were to make this happen every time, the scenario would be easier to balance because there is less randomness. There would be less setup text because you don't have to deal with as much act shuffling. And the big win, I think, is this situation is just awesome. It does mean there's a lot of fight pressure guaranteed placed on you while you're dealing with Abrietis, making her harder to kill. As it stands, there's a 1 in 4 chance of that anyway, so it should already be balanced around it, even though it's not really. I would suggest doing this and then making Abrietis a little bit easier to kill, 6+2 players maybe. Because as it stands, if you're being swarmed by the hunters every turn, then maybe you can't actually kill her as efficiently. And I do want to stop and say just how elegant the Altar of Despair is for an alternative win condition. My tables universally agreed. I was focused on the fact that I had no chance of doing this whatsoever in my first playthrough, but after seeing it in the 3-player game, this is the most elegant, well-designed alternate win condition I've ever seen in any scenario. Because over the course of the scenario, you're going to be building up kin cards who eventually get to Abrietis. If you have very few of them, you can very easily kill them all and fight Abrietis. Abrietis isn't really that scary for a boss enemy, it just has a lot of health. But if you have a ton of them, then you can do the Altar of Despair, because you get +1 for every kin-traded card at this location. I thought it was that you had, but it's at this location, so it's only test 5 because Abrietis. With a couple of players with kin cards, you very quickly get this down to like guaranteed pass territory, short of auto-fail. So even though 2 players +2 is a big number, it's very easy to hit if this is the right win condition for you to go for. It's just that I got there so late, there was no chance of me ever doing this. I cannot overstate how much this specific setup rocks. This is awesome, and it should be a core part of this campaign. I said in the previous video that I want every boss to have the text where they're forcing you to draw attacks. If there are any attacks in the deck, then the agenda or the act or the boss should be discarding and forcing you to draw them. And that's what this is. The attack is the other aliens running after you. If there's cool shit in your campaign, don't leave it up to random chance. Make your player deal with it. I do actually need to come back to this scenario because there are 2 things that I want to talk about real quick that I forgot about. And that will be the portraits and the Daughter of the Cosmos agenda card. The force text here is not the same on all teams. I don't really understand why the agenda before this one has player scaling doom. It seems to me that the idea is you need more time to get rid of all of your kin cards, but you also have an extra player to help get rid of them, so that doesn't really check out. Also, you're likely already going to see all the kin cards before you get to Abrietis, meaning that you just get rid of all of them once if you're killing her either way, and if you're doing the other win condition, you don't even need more time. I just don't fully understand why there's player scaling doom on this, because it doesn't seem like this scenario is anti-player scaling. It seems objectively harder on lower player counts from my 3 plays of it now. And then coming down to this one, this force text is objectively worse on lower player counts. On higher player counts, you're more likely to draw enemies, and then this effect just doesn't go off. Likewise, killing a kin enemy is a static amount of actions, and you have less actions on a smaller player count. So this is hurting lower player counts even more, and this is an action to spend 2 player clues. And what I would really like to see to help with the player count scaling, I don't think this line needs to be here at all. I think this should just be like an 11 or 12 doom agenda or split into 2 smaller agendas that are flat amounts. I just don't think this needs player scaling. That's just helping big teams for no reason. And over here on the Portraits of the Headmaster, I would like to see these reworked to be lightning bolt player at this locations spend 2 player clues. That helps out smaller groups, very minor buff to bigger groups. And spend 2 player clues means that you can't all do it, which actually does make the scenario hard lockable if you all end up with, say, 7 clues in your 4-player game and no one can open a portrait. So that does need to be as a group regardless of whether or not it becomes a lightning bolt. And lastly, in case I forgot to talk about it, I think I did, the hidden lift is just kind of useless. Since you have to spend an action to get into it, it's only saving you actions if you're moving at least 3 locations. As you get in, teleport down, get out, that's 2 actions. You could have just walked down twice. And since you need to go into all the portraits, you're not trying to move multiple locations at once. This is only helpful if you're already at it and you're carrying multiple people, but that should never be the case because you all need to go down 1 location at a time and scan the rooms. And like a 4-player game, it can teleport people to the bottom when they start going up, but that's just making it even easier for large player groups. This doesn't really seem to be useful in any way on 2 or 3 player games, and that's going to be exceptionally true on 1 player games. I'm going to go ahead and add some amendments to the end of the video for things that I missed that seem important. The first is, this sort of goes hand in hand with this bit needing a cleanup from the previous video. The recorded things here aren't actually accurate. For instance, there's nowhere you record that you parlayed with the last scholar. That's absolutely a thing you do. That's one of your choices. But if you go to Frailty of Men 4, you get a bunch of other choices. The Doctor's Examination doesn't record that. Frailty of Men 5 doesn't record that. I don't know where Unpleasant Associations is immediately because I'm not seeing anything named that, which gets right back into the whole cleanup thing. However, I'm not recording this no matter where I go, so this stuff needs to be cleaned up as part of the cleanup of the previous text. Additionally, there's really nothing in here that says, like, shuffle the agenda deck. There's nothing that immediately indicates that it's random. I guess to some degree it will kind of always be unintentionally random, but I feel like it should be mentioned, it should be here. And as we get to a call beyond, I'm going to stop recording for now, because it turns out my tabletop group hasn't played this yet, but I'm sure we'll be playing it later today, because my group is hype as hell to finish this campaign after Altar of Despair. So I'll be picking this up in a few hours, once I'm able to. We've wrapped up the last 2 scenarios of this campaign. I've got my notes, let's talk about A Call Beyond and Communion one last time. In my first video, I was still going back and forth on rules a little bit, still working out how exactly the scenario is supposed to work, and I forgot a problem with Mikolash. It's the reason that I don't think you can shatter a location with an enemy on it. And the reason is, what happens if you shatter Mikolash's location? There's a lot of stuff about Mikolash that references him being alive, him being out of play, and definitely by all accounts, he's supposed to be alive or out of play. After all, if you would defeat Mikolash, you're either advancing the act, or you're going to the act that then has, each time he is defeated, set him aside out of play. But you don't always defeat enemies, sometimes you just discard them. Now, most of that does say non-elite, but one way to discard an enemy would be, let's say this was a location. If this location were removed from the game, everything attached to it would just be discarded, like Mikolash. So without either further clarification on the rules for shattering, saying you can't do it outright, or without some sort of umbrella phrase on Mikolash, either on him or the axe, this makes an impossible scenario. This breaks the scenario when you shatter his location. So something somewhere must be clarified to fix this, and I would encourage it to be an umbrella phrase saying that this counts as defeating him. The reason for that is because it's really going to slow down the scenario if you're making us kill every enemy. So when I played this, you'll notice I've actually set up the map wrong. I played this scenario wrong. I played it in a true square. When I played this, I told my team that it ran really, really long for me, and with me to guide them the rules, it shouldn't be as bad, but it wasn't actually a square. It doesn't really fit on Tabletop Sim. You have to do like that, because 4 locations don't fit down here. Do you guys just want to cut out 2 locations? All it does is make the scenario shorter. And they're like, yeah, why not? And after we finished the scenario, I don't think we had finished. I think it was like 20 minutes before you finished. Our scenario ran about 2.5 hours, which was faster than my first playthrough. A lot of my first playthrough was stumbling through rules. And with me there to guide them with meta knowledge, with rules understanding, it's not as long, but it's still long. But with me there to guide them, and 2 of the locations removed, one of my players is like, man, I don't know, maybe it should just be 2 on each side. And I don't think that. I think that's definitely wrong. But I want to reiterate, this scenario definitely still runs too long. Coming back to rules clarifications though, each mirror chamber gains the following action: spend player's X clues, use the nightmare mirror to shatter X adjacent locations. So I didn't even realize I was maybe misinterpreting this. In my mind, that meant that you could spend 1 or 2 player clues to sacrifice 1 or 2 locations, or to shatter them rather. One of my players thought that meant that you could do 1, then 2, then 3 all in the same action, because after you shatter the first one, then the next one's adjacent, but that's not really the case. The scenario already runs long, and there's a way to phrase this that allows you to do both of those things without, like, doing anything negative. So, if it's not supposed to allow you to do all of them to avoid confusion and speed up the scenario, I would recommend allowing it to do all of them. And then, since it's allowed to do all, you don't have to specify what you can't do. You do what's in the rules and you don't what's not, so then you're clear. What I would recommend phrasing this as is spend X player's clues, use the nightmare mirror to shatter the X closest locations in the same row or column. So that would mean that it doesn't matter if these 2 are the only adjacent ones. If you spend 3x, you can take this one and this one and that one, or you can just take all the ones in this row. And I think that would work a lot smoother. There'd be less confusion about what this means, and if it's not supposed to mean that currently, which I think it is, I think maybe I was playing it wrong. I think it does mean you can already do this. There won't be that confusion about whether or not you can, because like technically you get into the whole geared up backpack argument, which required rules clarification, and now this is a different set of rules in a custom campaign. So again, it requires rules clarification because we can't extrapolate from anything else. I would definitely suggest alternate phrasing on that. There's also a hard lock that you can have in this scenario. Mensa's puppet's going to patrol to empty space, and as an additional cost for you to enter their location, you must spend 1 additional action. Now, it's possible that you could argue based on the rules we previously had that empty space isn't a location and they literally do nothing, but that's very clearly not the spirit. Rules will be changed to fix that. And I think the new empty space location stuff might specifically not say that anymore. That was a copy paste from old Black Throne stuff. Here's the issue with them. They all patrol to the same place, so if they all patrol to the same location, if you get all 3 at once, it now costs 3 additional actions to enter this, and you don't have that many actions. And since it's a cost, you can't just give up the rest of your turn. So you could change this to say after you enter this enemy's location, you must spend an additional action. If you do something like that, I would recommend definitely making them tougher. Maybe give them just like a shitload of health, 4 or 5, maybe make them actually hard to hit, maybe make them threatening in some way. But as it stands currently, if you have all 3 in the same location, you cannot enter that location unless you have additional actions. We actually did get in that situation. We had to pull at a crossroads on Daniela or Pathfinder, I don't remember which one, but someone had to sacrifice an entire turn to crack a triple puppet location by just cheating the movement initially and then spending their whole turn once they were inside, or to get inside, rather. Now, there's one more major problem, and that's that Mikolash can just AFK if you end up in a position like this. It's not hard to get in positions like this. I feel like if you know about this, you can orchestrate them really easily, because Mikolash is going to be breaking the furthest empty location every agenda flip. There are a lot of encounter cards that break the closest location. So you can end up in a position where you're like, all right, let's try to orchestrate this. And now Mikolash will just bounce between these every single agenda. He doesn't do anything anymore, he's just AFK. He's not running past you and hitting you anymore, he's just AFK. Don't come to this corner of the map and he won't mess with you. And admittedly, that's accurate to the boss fight. If you just want to hang out in the dungeon, you can. You don't have to go kill him. But it definitely is not a good scenario when the doom clock ceases to matter and the guy who's supposed to be threatening you and attacking you isn't doing it. And I don't know what to put in to mess with that. Maybe you can have a card like Through the Looking Glass or even just rework Through the Looking Glass. So instead of running away from you, he teleports to your location, which does help the fighter kill him, but that's not really a problem. The fighter's already chasing him down, trying to kill him, fighting enemies. Sometimes he'll teleport to your location, it will be a problem, you'll draw it like right before the agenda's gonna flip and you're terrified of this guy now. I don't know. It feels like there should be something somewhere that's ripping him cross map to you so that he actually keeps griefing you, and nothing does that currently, which allows him to lock out of the game over here with parallel empty locations. And I'm not sure what does need to be changed to fix this specifically, but something must be changed to fix this. Before we get into Scenario 7, I need to talk about Lawrence the First Figure, and the numbers I've been seeing with recognition. Now, unfortunately for me, every time I playtested this, I have had characters that inflate recognition. Parallel Skids probably takes like 3 times more tests than anyone else because he's gambling every single turn. He's got big money stuff, so he's taking a lot of extra actions. Parallel Skids might be worth like an entire team on his own. He's probably worth around 3 people, I guess. But Ursula's in the same boat because she's using her investigate action on her card, double Eon charts. She's taking like 3 extra actions a turn too. She gets a million clues, but it's just by investigate over and over again. So in our 3-player game, we probably had 4 or 5 players of clues because of Ursula. And the numbers I've seen for recognition in 2-player were 27 and 3-player got up to 33. And obviously this last agenda will get them down a bit, but you could have seen Lawrence in the previous scenario. There's Milkweed there too. And he scales off of every 3 level recognition. And it turns out that we all looked at that, we checked the log, we saw that he had 11 fists, and we said, all right, what are we gonna house roll that to? Because it's not 11. Like we all debated for a little while, we said, should we go with 5? And at first we said yes, and then like by the end of the first turn of him being at 7 fists, the Flex Fighter Joe was like, should we change it to every 6 or 7? And I was like, nah, we're good. We made this bed, now we gotta sleep in it. And we did get through him. Luckies and Live and Learns and Time Worn Brands and Vicious Blow 2s and Ursula to trip the guy repeatedly and Lucky 3 to make sure the trip was guaranteed even though he's got 6 foot. Like we eventually got through this. But it built the entire scenario out of shape to deal with this. And I think the easiest solution to someone having too much recognition is simply, like nothing else I've seen cares about recognition really, right? I don't know what's in Scenario 8. It seems to me like this is similar to Dark Matter and that the payoff for recognition Scenario 7, in Scenario 7 in Dark Matter, you get to reduce your doom using memories. In Scenario 7 here, you make the agenda not kill you with your recognition. And with this one specifically, this is the only thing that seems to care about my specific number of recognition. Just give them a ceiling, just like put up to max 6 or something like that. And also, it probably should be more than every 3 levels of recognition, because the rate we've been going, I feel like literally everyone's going to see him at 6 fist presently. Now, moving on to Scenario 7 properly, I playtested both the versions I hadn't seen with my tabletop group. We did Murgo's first, and after about 30 minutes, we finished the scenario, and we all agreed we should play the scenario again in a scenario version that was a little bit more well-structured. So the issue with the Murgo's Wet Nurse version is when you advance the act, you put Murgo's Wet Nurse in play up here, then at the end of the round you trigger their ability and they enter, which just advances the act immediately. Okay, what happens then? You all get attacked, and then when we kill Wet Nurse and they've just moved our location, the scenario ends. And it turns out that, like, wherever I put it, the Wet Nurse's Lunarium, to go here, you're gonna need to, you know, use 2 keys as a group, and then the story effect, it doesn't have any. It's just victory 1. I mean, yeah, other enemies that aren't Wet Nurse can't come in here. That's helpful, I guess. But mostly, it's just victory 1. And this stuff doesn't really keep Murgo alive for any particular length of time. Like, yeah, on Wings of Black will make them a little bit inconvenient, but you just all stack up together and wait for Murgo to come and stomp on them. Like, we took a screen cap of when we killed Murgo. It was 7 Doom into the first agenda. It would have been 2 turns earlier if it hadn't went to Joe, who was not equipped to fight, followed by immediately running away once we got to Joe. Like, Murgo just got stomped. We didn't really play the scenario, and we weren't really forced to play the scenario either. It sort of just feels like there's iterative work to be done here where the scenario with Murgo's variant isn't quite finished yet. Coming over to the Brain of Mensis, all of my complaints about hitting you twice are invalid because you physically can't get to its location. It'll be at the Spire of Mensis, which, the other side, nope, this side. Oh, it's on the act, that's what it is. You'll see here, you cannot enter the Spire of Mensis, so it can't actually hit you twice. It's just going to hit you if you're in the location, so you're good. And then once it falls to the bottom, it turns off, it exhausts, it never readies again, it'll never attack, it'll never use its force effect, you're just going to beat it to death, much like you do in the real game. So that problem solved, but now we have new problems, unfortunately. First, I do think this is just written in a way that's obtuse and unhelpful. Investigators cannot enter the Spire of Mensis, just have that be on this side. This shouldn't even be the Spire of Mensis. I mean, it should be the Spire of Mensis on the unrevealed side, and then it flips over to the Dark Pit when you drop the brain. But it doesn't need a shroud value or a clue value. The force text should just be the same text as is at the Bourse and Scarlet Keys, which is used elsewhere here. I'll go grab it just in case. You can have whatever flavor text you want, not important, but what it should say is this last line: enemies cannot enter the Bourse, and if an enemy would spawn here, spawn it at a connecting location instead. Except instead of just saying enemies, it should be investigators and enemies cannot enter the Bourse. And that should just be on the unrevealed side, much like this. Then you flip it over, and then you have it dropped in the pit where it's completely helpless and you kill it, which gets into the last criticism of the Brain of Mensis. 10 health is a lot to sit there and grind through, like it's not particularly fun. And since enemies can enter the pit now, like nothing says they can't, so since enemies can now enter this pit, the Winter Lanterns can enter this pit. And reminder, the cardinal locations around the map you couldn't stand in, and Winter Lanterns are aloof. And you don't want them with you because they'll be hitting you, they don't spawn with you. So very likely they've been running around behind you, you haven't been able to deal with them. Suddenly the brain opens, you can go in the middle now. And you have like a Winter Lantern here and then like 2 over here. So your fighter's not actually just gonna walk in there and hit this guy, because 10 health is so much per player that these guys will just like catch up and hit your whole team for 6 horror as each one individually walks in. So that's not really tenable. Instead, your main fighter is likely just gonna be trying to deal with these brains as fast as they can and not actually finishing the story. And it's just a slog, because you win, you know you've won, but you have to grind through 30 health and your fighter's really busy making sure that none of you die. And this would be like the exact same thing thematically if it was only 5 players' health. If, like the text on every Edis, there was some additional text that made you deal extra damage to the brain on either the location or the brain itself. But as it stands, it's just a slog, and it went from being really cool thematically to like, holy shit, we're on turn 5 of killing the brain, can we leave? Very quickly. But on the whole, I do really like the brain variation. The bit at the end where it clearly grinds on too long, and a big part of it is the play pattern with the Winter Lanterns where you're not able to deal with them in the previous section, you're running around. That part's great, but then you have to sit still. And you can't do that, so you have to deal with these guys and it just becomes a grind. That needs to be resolved. Anyways, I think that's actually it for now. We had a great time playing this. On the whole, for an alpha stage, this campaign is in a wonderful spot. I hope this feedback was helpful and helps to build a better end product eventually. And I'm done. I've been Ryan Coherent. I hope this was helpful. I hope you enjoyed this if you aren't the developer, which statistically you probably aren't. And if you did, then like, comment, subscribe. All that stuff really does help the channel grow. And I'll see you in the next one.